This episode of Advocates, the podcast, is supported by Taylor's Law School, where you get to learn about law and justice, explore how these top advocates battle injustice as they tell us their stories.
Listen to the voices of the advocates.
Welcome to Advocates, the podcast. Today, I speak with Eason Rajah QC, the former chairman of the Chancery Bar Association. In his field, Eason has represented high net worth individuals, the Nizam of Hyderabad being the latest example. But he tells me that the most memorable case he ever had was successfully defending a down-and-out client in a small county court matter. Perhaps in his heart, he is the lawyer that he always aspired to be, a human rights lawyer. Join me in my conversation with Eason Rajah. Hi, Eason.
Hello. Hi, Razwan.
Right. So we'll start off, as tradition dictates, with a family and background. You're from Malaysia. Which part exactly from Malaysia?
I'm from Ipoh.
Right. So tell us a bit about your home then in Ipoh.
My father was a lawyer in Ipoh. My mother was a teacher, which he gave up when the three children came along. And we had a pretty idyllic time growing up in Ipoh. It's a nice, sleepy place, but, small enough to be able to get around and do everything and big enough to have everything you need. We had a great time, really.
So you went to school in Ipoh as well?
Yes, I went to ACS in Ipoh until I was 11. I went back when I was an adult and looked through the windows of the classrooms and couldn't imagine how small the desks and the chairs were.
Yeah. And your dad, what type of lawyer was he?
He was a partner in a firm called Maxwell Kenyon Cowdy and Jones. It's one of the old colonial firms. It was actually a specialist tin mining firm. That's what they did. But obviously, as the tin mining industry sort of collapsed, they had to move out into more general practice. And so he was a litigator, truth be told, and an advocate. But that's the sort of law he did when he was in Ipoh.
All right. And your siblings, what do they do now?
Both of them have a life of luxury now. They don't do anything, but they were qualified as a pharmacist. One's a pharmacist and one's a lawyer, but they're a bit older than me and they've decided to put their feet up. I'm the only one left working hard for a living.
Oh, I see. Right. All right. And we will talk about your working life a bit later. At 11, you were sent off to England to boarding school. How do you find it? I mean, at such a young age, in Malaysia, as you know, there's a lot of boarding schools as well, but you don't go to a foreign country, you still remain and you get to go home during holidays, which I'm sure you did as well, but it's still, 6,000 miles away. How did you find that when you as an 11-year-old child?
8,000 miles away. I think actually...
Oh, sorry, 8.
It was hardest for my mother, and she made the decision to send me, and they did it with the best of intentions because my sisters had gone to England before me to boarding school, and my parents had worked out that the earlier they sent me, the better it would be for me. My sisters had struggled a bit with the transition from the Malaysian syllabus to the English syllabus. And so that reflected in their grades at O-levels and A-levels. And they worked out that actually the sooner they sent me, the better it would be for me. And certainly as regards O-levels, they were right. But you asked the question, how was it? It's not, I had the choice of whether or to send my children to boarding school. And in the end, my wife and I decided we wouldn't. It's a choice. There are all sorts of upsides to going to boarding school, but there are also downsides. And in those days, in particular, there was a huge cultural difference to get to grips with because having foreign students in an English prep school was pretty unusual, and those schools were rife in those days with both physical and psychological bullying. And there were all sorts of unwritten codes. There's no question of reporting anything to a teacher. If you had an issue. The ultimate way in which you resolve the issue was, the whole school, all the boys descended on the gym to watch you beating each other up while you resolve your issue in the gym. That's how things got resolved. And so, having had a fairly mollycoddled upbringing in Malaysia, it was quite an eye-opening experience to come to school at the age of 11. But for me, it was a good one because, at the very least, it taught me that I could cope with adversity and, gradually over time, how to deal with the sort of bullies you come across in life. And, I think for me, boarding school, not necessarily just from the age of 11, but throughout all the way through to 18, and the independence of having to be on your own for all of that period built a lot of what I now see as my character. Of course, I should also say, all of those things about boarding school in the 80s, all completely different now. I mean, there's no question of bullying being tolerated in schools these days. Even by the time I left Epsom, where Gopal was as well, even by the time I left Epsom College at the age of 18, bullying was very much frowned upon and largely being stamped out. And these days, it's just non-existent in schools. But it was a different experience back then.
Mm.
Can I just jump in, Eason, and ask you this? In terms of your relationship with your parents, being in boarding school from as young as that, did it affect it? And if so, how?
I think it did, but in a good way. There's no question that if you go away to boarding school and then you come home, you do not pick up a relationship in the same place you left it. And so it is different, and there are much more arguments. But over time, I think both sides, came to value the time we got to spend together. And, made much of a bigger effort to get on and to value the time we had together. And, you spend more time talking about things, particularly as you get older. You spend more time in your holidays talking about things which, have struck you while you were at school and you wondered about and thought, well, there's nobody to ask, and you save it up, and you were on holiday one day, you talk about it, and you see it's not just your parents, you see your grandmother, and you suddenly, you actually want to know her life story, but in a way which on a day-to-day basis, these things just don't happen. You just don't think about them. So I think actually it changed the relationship, I think, for the better.
Absence do make the heart grow fonder, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right. After your A-levels, you then, of course, went to Nottingham University to read law. I mean, and this is the traditional question we ask everyone. And why law? Is it because you're horrible at the sciences, or is it because of your dad, or what's the motivation there?
Well, you must understand that I'm a Sri Lankan Tamil, and when I was growing up, there were only 4 jobs which were worth doing. You could be an accountant, an engineer, a doctor, or a lawyer, and you had to pick one of those. And my parents wanted me to be a doctor, and actually science was my stronger field. But perhaps it was a bit of teenage rebellion, but I decided as they wanted me to be a doctor, I'd be a lawyer instead. So that's why I studied law.
I mean, to be frank, Eason, I rebel against my parents by doing law. I mean,
I know.
Not exactly that clash, is it?
I'm a good Tamil boy. That's how teenage rebellion works for a good Tamil boy. Yes.
Okay, right. So it was, I suppose, like you said, rebellion then. But did your dad's career inspire you? And he said, what, that's not a bad lifestyle,
That's very astute, Razlan, because in the end, I think it is. I think it's partly personality. I think I see it in my son and my daughter. My son quite wants to have a lifestyle which he can see and can understand, and it's clear how to get there. Whereas my daughter is prepared to go out into the bright blue world and find whatever suits her. And I think to some extent, I could see that my father was an honourable and respected man and had a lifestyle which seemed to me to be a good one and one to aspire to. And I think, that had a huge influence in me deciding that was both a career and a lifestyle which I would want to be involved in.
All right. After you graduated, then obviously, in England, you had a choice either to become a solicitor or a barrister. What ultimately decided that the bar it is as opposed to doing the solicitor's course?
It's not quite a choice in the way you put it. I was intending to come back and practice in Malaysia. And if you were intending to practice in Malaysia, you did the bar course because it was a quicker route to getting back to Malaysia. Otherwise, you would have to do the Law Society finals plus 2 years of a training contract, which meant you had to get a job. So basically, all Malaysians in England in those days who were intending to go back to Malaysia did the bar course, and that was the qualification which was recognized in Malaysia. So I didn't actually choose between becoming a solicitor or becoming a barrister. I did the bar course because I was intending to go back to Malaysia.
And then you did go back to Malaysia, right? Didn't you? I know you qualified as an advocate and solicitor at the High Court of Malaya in 1991.
What I did first, actually, I did the bar course, and then I did my pupillage in England. And it's only after my pupillage and after I was offered a tenancy that I came back and qualified in Malaysia as an advocate and a solicitor. So I took a break between the end of pupillage and taking up my tenancy.
Sorry, can I jump in and just back you up a little bit, Eason, and that route that you took? First, obviously, because your Malaysian bar is the quicker and easier route to get back to Malaysia to practice, but did you foresee yourself being an advocate in Malaysia at that time?
Yes. Yeah. So I assume, my father being an advocate, I sort of just equated being a lawyer with being an advocate. And, I'd always been quite good at public speaking. So that for me was what the job entailed. So it suited me. If you told me what the risks were for a practice at the bar in England versus becoming a solicitor in England, if that was the choice I was making, I think in those days I would probably have become a solicitor.
The second question is following from that is the route you took to doing pupillage in the UK and then getting called in the UK before you went back to Malaysia. The usual course for Malaysian graduates and who are called to the bar in the UK would have been to go straight back home. So why did you decide to do that? And secondly, it must have been hugely competitive. How did you manage to find yourself a set of chambers?
Well, firstly, the reason why I decided to do pupillage was largely to do with the fact that I'd met my present wife at university. And it suddenly came clear to me that at the end of the bar course, unless I did something, that relationship was coming to an end. I was going home. So I persuaded my parents that it would be a good thing for me, whatever I decided to do pupillage. You say competitive. Of course, it is ferociously competitive now. But at the time, I was the beneficiary of both accident and good fortune, because in those days there was a 30% pass rate at the bar course. I had not just passed the bar course, but I'd passed it with flying colours. And so even though pupillagers were being, you needed to have applied for a pupillage about a year before the bar course, I touted myself around after the bar course, and there were all these sets of chambers which found that the pupils who they were intending to have in September or October had failed the bar course, so they had vacancies. So actually there were lots of vacancies around. So I managed to acquire both, firstly, a criminal pupillage for 6 months and then a chancery pupillage for 6 months, taking the place of some poor soul who failed the bar exams. So actually at the time it wasn't terribly competitive.
You said it was just a 30% passing rate. That was because it was a different type of bar exams, wasn't it, as compared to now, right?
That's right, yeah.
It was a traditional examination style as opposed to the vocational course that you have now.
It was the toughest exams I've ever had to do. There were 6 exams, and they were, I think almost all of them were 3 hours each. Not open book. They were tough. They were marked hard.
Looking back now that you are Queen's Counsel now, and honestly speaking, do you think that style of examinations or qualifications, was it actually relevant to the practice that you are doing now? Or do you think that the present way a student undergoes the bar course is a better way in preparing their future careers at the bar?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think in terms of preparing one for the skills which you need at the bar, probably the current way is better. But I think in terms of finding the people with the right temperament and the right intellect, the old way was probably better at sorting out the people who have what it takes and those who don't. So a lot of people can now qualify through the bar course and will be trained in the skills which they need, better trained in the skills which they need. But will they all be successful at the bar? No, they won't. Whereas I think the old days, those who passed, there was a better guide as to those who would be successful at the bar.
Okay, so you completed your pupillage in England, but after that you went back to Malaysia to try to get Malaysian qualifications.
Yes, that's right.
You obviously qualified as well in Malaysia. And What made you decide to come back to England? Was it love?
I think that was undoubtedly a very important factor. I met my wife.
Your wife will be listening to this, by the way. Just to step.
She's not listening right now.
When we release it, she will.
I met my wife 32 years ago, and we've been married for 27 years. And even then, at the outset, I knew this was, a very important relationship. So it was undoubtedly an important factor in my decision to go back. And it was a big decision because my family were very keen that I stayed in Malaysia. And, Malaysia has a practice in Malaysia, particularly for me in those days with my family. It would have been such an easy thing to do, and it would have been a great lifestyle. But in Malaysia, you are both a solicitor and an advocate. And I had already done my pupillage in England, and I'd seen the way the English bar works, where it's much more streamlined. You're simply an advocate, and actually, that is a really attractive job. To simply be the advocate, not to have to deal with all of the crud which comes along with being both the solicitor and the advocate. So it was also a more attractive job to come back and do it here. And so that also, and of course, when you're young, you think you're going to conquer the world. So you don't think about the risks. You don't think that you might not succeed. You just say, well, I'll go back and I'll, have a go in England. So I did. So it was those two things, more attractive job, plus my wife was here, and she was definitely not coming to Malaysia. So it was me coming back here or nothing.
So when you went back to England, you got a place in Chambers, and I saw an interview you made where initially you thought of doing basically crime and human rights, and you then switched to the Chancery portion of the bar. How did that happen?
That actually happened in pupillage. I mean, when I came to the bar, when I started pupillage, I was thinking I'm only interested in doing crime and human rights. And I remember my father laughing because I told him I was going to come back and practice in Malaysia in crime and human rights. And, he just laughed and said, you'll be doing that out of a prison cell. In those days, that's what it was.
It still is.
And yeah, quite still is. And he very astute man, knew me better than I knew myself in those days, and said, I think you would like corporate law or chancery law. He insisted I did at least 6 months of pupillage in one of those. And so to humor him, I got a chancery pupillage, as I say, at the time when I could choose really where I went. He was right. Having done 6 months in crime, by the time I finished it, I was slightly disillusioned with crime and the system, which I thought was a largely middle-class based system of values being imposed on the poor. And actually, I found that the chancery work I found enormously challenging and interesting. It was problem solving, and I loved it. So I decided I'd stick with chancery.
Can I ask, when you made that decision to come back to the UK, and by the way, up to this point, there's clearly nothing that's inspired you to do law or become a barrister at all, barring the fact that your wife was in the UK. That's pretty much clear.
Yeah. Yes.
But my question actually relates to your relationship at home. Typically a Malaysian Indian family, the only son, your dad's partnership is there, and he would have loved, I'm sure, for you to have joined his practice and continued with him. How was that for the family to deal with, your decision to come back to the UK and practice here?
I think it was very hard. I mean, there were lots of sort of discussions about this. My mother found it very hard. My father approached it fairly rationally with sort of logical arguments as to why I shouldn't. But I think what both of them did, which was very, very sensible, was recognize that it was in the end my decision, and that if I made my decision, they would support me whatever I decided. And that was important because it preserved our relationship forevermore, really. And that's how it worked in the end.
Before I move on, could you just describe to our listeners I mean, the challenges of preserving a long-term relationship with your family when you are in England and they are there in Malaysia. Because today, when I'm talking to my children, they don't understand, because I studied in England too, they don't understand simply the challenge of the distance and the time, because you have, the magic handphone, yeah? Whereas those days, you I suppose you got to rely on letters and the phone calls were terribly expensive. Yeah, how often, were you in contact with your parents, and were you waiting anxiously for the aerogram to come through? And what is an aerogram? And please explain what's an aerogram, by the way.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Those days, the rule was write home once a week. So in theory, every week one wrote a letter home, and the cheapest way of writing a letter home was to buy an aerogram, which is basically an unfolded envelope on blue paper, which once you finish writing on the inside of this unfolded envelope, you fold it up into an envelope and seal it, and then you send it, and that was an aerogram. And that's how we communicated. We wrote to each other once a week, and I still remember, and my sisters do very fondly, my father's letters, which we very quickly told him he had to stop writing letters and to get his secretary to type them, because we couldn't read his writing at all. So in the end, he would dictate his letters, and they would come on an aerogram, but sometimes he didn't have very much to say. It was, these are when your flights are booked, and so on. And so they'd be quite short, but they were always great letters. And my mother used to write as well. So that's how we wrote. And obviously, as you get older, we just got worse and worse at writing. There was, when I was in Epsom, there was a phone box in the house, which as in the boarding house which I was in. So, in an emergency, you could, with a pile of 50p coins, you could make a phone call, or even better, in those days, you could phone the operator and do a reverse charges call so that your parents paid for it. So, if you actually needed to speak to them, you could. But basically, during term time, you were on your own, and you didn't really deal with your parents other than keep in touch with them and let them know once in a while you were still alive. Then that was about it, really.
Yep. Right. Okay. So young Eason Rajah now has qualified for the bar. He got his place in chambers. He's doing chancery work. What sort of chancery work did you do in the first few years of your practice?
Well, I came out in the middle of the recession in 1991. And so I basically took away people's houses, wound up their businesses, and made them bankrupt. Or I was on the other side trying to stop people taking away my clients' houses, trying to stop them winding up their companies and trying to stop them making them bankrupt. But that's the sort of work which was there at the time. And there was a lot of it. It was busy.
So you didn't have problems getting work then?
No. In those days, if you were in a mainstream set of chambers, there was work. There was a sort of steady throughput of chambers work for the bottom end. And there still is. The challenge is to transition from that junior work in your first year to getting work in your own name after the first year and after the second and the third year and so on. But there was certainly work.
So how long was you in practice doing all this, I suppose, debt collection work or defending your client's house being foreclosed, before finally you got a case when you thought, yeah, I can do this, I know this stuff. I'm home at the Chancery Bar. Was there any particular case that you say, yeah, this is it?
No, I'm still waiting.
Okay. Not even acting for the Nizam of Hyderabad, is it?
No, I'm still waiting for a case which will make me be clear that I'm at home at the Chancery Bar. That's not true. Actually, I say that that's the bulk of the work which we're doing. But of course, you also do all sorts of other small cases when you start. I don't think I've ever had that sort of moment where I've thought, this is it, I'm at home at the Chancery Bar. Until I took Silk, I always simply thought I was an imposter who had somehow snuck in under the radar and no one had really found me out. And it was really only when I took Silk that I thought, actually, perhaps people think that I can actually do this job. So that, for me, I think, was the moment at which I first started to think I could do it.
Eason, if I could ask, the early years at the bar Two questions. Was there any particular member of Chambers or barrister, senior barrister that you worked with that particularly inspired you? That's one. And the second thing, and I think I want to explore this a little bit later as well, how important is it for a young barrister, or was it for a young barrister then and now, to have a good relationship with the clerking room?
Okay, the first question, someone who influenced me. There were lots of people in Chambers who influenced me in many different ways. My head of Chambers, when I joined, was a chap called Leo Price QC, and I didn't know him at all who he was when I joined, but I gradually learned that he had been, really one of the stellar silks when he was in his heyday. And by the time I joined, he was, in his 60s. But in his heyday, he had been, one of sort of 4 or 5 silks to whom the greatest cases in the land would go. They were always in the frame. And he had done he was one of the old style silks who'd done a case in pretty much every major area and taken it to the House of Lords and got a major decision on it. Really extraordinary achievement. And he was such a nice and humble man. And even in his 60s, he had the most enormous work ethic. He was always the first person into Chambers, and he was always the last person to leave. I mean, he wouldn't leave. He'd still be there at midnight, and he'd be in Chambers by 8 a.m. And when you start and you see someone like that, who has achieved so much, who is still working like that, you suddenly realize, actually, the fact that you've got a tenancy doesn't mean you've made it. You've just started, and you've got to work. So that was a huge influence. And then there were all manner of other people in Chambers from whom you learnt different things. But the bit about it which I remember about, I learnt about all of this was, how nice people were. There was no backstabbing. They were all supportive. And, what I learnt very quickly was, if you're going to survive at the bar, you need to achieve things by not stepping on other people. You need to be able to look back on your career and say, I got where I did, without putting down someone else. And you can support other people. There's plenty of room for everyone to succeed. I learned that from many people in Chambers.
And then the clerking side of things?
Clerking room, I think it is important. It's probably more important in those days than it is now, because I think clerks these days have much less influence on who gets work. But in those days, they had a huge amount of influence. Clerks, the first rule is, if you're successful, the clerks will support you, come what may, because you're bringing them money. But, you can be the nastiest person in the world, they will still support you. But getting on with the clerks is a good idea, and it is important. But I have always taken the view that I won't take any trouble from the clerks. I'm very clear about what I want, and it's been so I'm firm, and I don't have a problem telling them if I disagree with something, and it's worked fine.
Right. Could I just ask you, Eason, before we go, because you said you've on your comment just now before Gopal came in on that, the fact that you've somehow rather always felt as if you are some sort of an imposter, and that's before you took Silk. I just want to know 2 questions there. Number one, why do you have this feeling, considering you've let's to be frank, you've done really, really well. You've came from Malaysia, you managed to get set in Chambers, you top scored in your bar exams, and your careers, your junior bar career at least is going swimmingly well, and you still felt as if you are an imposter. And you said as well just now that second question is, you felt this way until you managed to get until you were appointed QC. So what changed?
Well, I think imposter syndrome is quite well known. I think there are a lot of barristers who feel it. And I can't explain to you why I felt it, but I always sort of assumed that there must be some mistake. Somewhere or other I've flown under the radar and got in, and somewhere or other I'm still getting this work and no one's actually noticed that I can't do it very well. It actually made me work harder because, I always assumed that the barrister on the other side knew more law and was cleverer than me. So I needed to work harder at my cases. So, probably was a good thing. What changed? When I was a senior junior, the point at which I decided to apply for Silk is I suddenly realized that actually people thought I could do this job, and I actually could do this job. By the time you're a senior junior, you are getting the best work which is available without a Silk. And I was one of a handful of names which was getting that work. And that's the point, really. And even when I applied for Silk, I didn't think I'd get it. I didn't know whether I'd get it, and I got it first time. And I applied very confident that I would get it. By the time you finished filling out the form, I was confident that I wouldn't get it, because the form is quite revealing. It asks you to examine yourself in lots of ways and explain how you have certain qualities. And you look at the form and you go, "Oh, I don't have that quality." Anyway, by the time you filled out the form, you're quite deconstructed yourself. You're pretty sure you're not going to get it. And then when I got it, it actually meant a lot to me, because it was a sign, actually, that because there's so many references which are taken from solicitors and from barristers and from judges, it actually was an endorsement that people thought I could do this job. And so very reinforcing. So that's the explanation about imposter syndrome and what the difference was.
Could I ask just about the application process for Silk? What year did you make your application?
I became Silk, I think, in 2011. So I would have made the application in 2010.
And apart from filling up this form, what were the other aspects of the process that you had to go through at that time?
So the form is a beast. I mean, it's something like, by the time you filled it out, it's 70 pages. It's not something you can do in a day. The form is a beast. You have to put down the names of, in those days, I think you have to put down your 10 top cases. You have to put down 5 judges from those 10 top cases, 5 Silks from that 10 top cases, and 5 solicitors from that 10 top cases. And the panel will then go, the QCA will then go to their choice from those of who they want for way of referees. So you have no control over who they go to ask. And if you make it through the paper sift and they take the references, you will be invited to an interview. And then you have a 1-hour interview, which is competency based, which is itself an experience. But at the end of that, they don't tell you anything. 2 months later, 3 months later, you get a letter in the post. And if you're lucky, your dog doesn't eat it. That's happened with my case. And that letter sort of tells you whether you got Silk or not.
Wow. Right. So you got Silk in 2011. I remember reading about you, actually. You made news back home here in Malaysia as well. And, for a Malaysian who's had a very successful career in England, is still relatively rare. And that's the thing, next part I want to ask you about, because, I mean, you're from Malaysia, you're an ethnic minority at the bar, and yet here you are, you've gone through the whole system. And to be frank, you're successful, right? I mean, were there any challenges on that aspect, on that note?
Well, I think firstly, being Malaysian is an asset, or was an asset when I came to the bar, in this way. You have I had a sort of work ethic and desire to succeed, which, comes from, my youth in Malaysia and looking at everyone else around me. Everyone had that sort of attitude to life. We've got to work hard. We've got to do something with our lives. So there's no sort of sitting on laurels. And so that was, I think, an important advantage. In terms of challenges, being an ethnic minority at the bar, in those days there were challenges. When I came to the bar, most ethnic minorities were congregated in a handful of sets of chambers, which were called ghetto chambers, because they couldn't get into mainstream sets of chambers. And it's my generation which broke that barrier. So I think I was the first Asian barrister. I think I was the first Asian barrister at the Chancery Bar when I got my tenancy. But, rapidly followed by other people. In my year, there was Rabinder Singh. He got into public law sets of chambers. And of course, he's now Lord Justice Rabinder Singh. And the year after me, Zia Balu, who's now Zia Balu QC, came to the Chancery Bar. And I think she was the second Asian barrister. And Pushpinder Saini joined, was it Brick Court or Essex Court? One of the very flash commercial sets, either that year or the year after that. So all of a sudden, we started to get into mainstream sets of chambers. And the reason for that was actually that generation of barristers, about 10 years more senior than us, were right-minded people who'd sort of come up and were now decision makers in chambers and were equalizing things. And so, it's not that I was fantastic. It's the generation above me who were there making the decisions were the ones who were suddenly equalizing and making the right sort of decisions about equality. which meant that I was able to come into a mainstream set of chambers. But even then, it was a very strange world. And there was certainly, in those days, there was still, a huge section of the bar, which was very old fashioned. There were members of clubs like, the Garrick and Whites, and they mixed in high society. And, there was no question of fitting in with them. We didn't have the class, if I can put it that way. The skill, I think, was to get on with all of these people without actually rubbing anyone up the wrong way or allowing yourself to feel that you were in any way less worthy because, you weren't a member of one of these grand clubs. And the other challenge, I think, and there were people like that in my chambers. In fact, one of them was my pupil master. The other challenge was that in those days, racism was just there. The clerks, bless them, were absolutely unracist and absolutely straight. But they would come in sometimes and just take away a set of papers and say, sorry, the clerk solicitors just realized that you're not white.
Oh.
And they want a white barrister. Or the client has realized you're not white. And the solicitor's very apologetic, but he's got to take the papers away and give them to somebody else. And you go, okay, fine. Actually, the worst people for that were actually people from our community. It was the Indian clients, the Chinese clients. You'd say, I want a white barrister. What can you do?
You're absolutely right. There's nothing worse than Asian on Asian racism, actually, which white people don't really know.
It's like the immigration counter at Heathrow, isn't it? You just do not want to.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Yeah. The white immigration officers are always so much nicer than the Asian ones. Right. Just another short question on this, just before we move on. You talk about your experience with clients and fellow solicitors. Judges, I'm not asking you to name names, but were there instances where they made it known that because you were not white or you were ethnic, that somehow or other your argument, is not so persuasive?
No, never. Not in England. Not once. And I'd heard that there were judges who were racist, and I've appeared before them and not had not been treated in the slightest way differently. So the bench I've had the most enormous respect for has always been egalitarian during my time, in my experience.
Okay, I'm gonna go into some general areas now. So when you became a QC, did the nature of your cases start to change, or is it just it became, simply more commercially valuable, or the type of cases that you get became harder actually in terms of the law?
Well, initially, you start getting paid a lot more to answer simpler questions than you deal with as a junior barrister, which is quite nice. But in the end, what happens is the cases are just much, much more complex. And you're leading a team rather than doing everything yourself. The big difference is when you're a junior, if it's your own case, you do everything on it. Whereas if you're a Silk, you will be part of a team. You can do stuff as Silk on your own, but increasingly with the more complicated cases, you have a large team. I've got a case at the moment where I'm leading another Silk and 2 juniors. And I also have another team in another country. And that's not. In fact, I have 2 cases like that, exactly like that, where I'm leading another Silk and a couple of juniors. Plus, I have another team in another country. So, and if you're doing that sort of work, you're ultimately just making the big decisions, and then other people are implementing it. Other people are doing the drafting. You're sort of shaping how it goes, and then in the end, you're standing up and doing the advocacy.
But in terms of work, because of that type of cases, is it actually possible for you to read everything, or is it a question of you have an overview and an understanding of the case, and then you decide, okay, you take this part, you take that part. Of course, then they'll come back to you and brief you. Is that how you do it, or are you the type of barrister that says, you know what, I know I got a large team, but I got to read every single piece of paper myself?
No, I don't take the view I need to read every single piece of paper myself. I take the view that my team needs to tell me what I need to read, and I read what I need to read. And that's the only way you can do it. Some of these cases have tens of thousands of documents. I did a case called Crociani, which went on for 8 years, and I started that case when I'd just taken Silk. But there were tens of thousands of documents in that case. If there was anybody in that case who knew more about that case than anyone else, it was me. But even so, I did not read every single bit of paper. We had teams of junior barristers looking at all the various bits of documents and sorting them out in terms of priority as to who needed to read what, elevating it through up to the more senior members, who would then do another filter to see, what I actually needed to read. It's the only way you can do it.
And is that also a function, if I might ask, of the fact that, you have these cases with 10,000 documents, but ultimately they probably turn on 100 or 50?
You're right. There's a lot of chaff which needs to be sorted out. And I mean, it's not 10,000. These were tens of thousands of documents. I think 10,000 documents, actually over 8 years, I could probably have read them all. But as you say, in the end, the documents which we referred to at trial, there were probably 150.
Can I ask one follow-up from that in terms of the drafting? Is there any document that you still say this is my turf, only I put ink to paper on this document?
No, I still like to draft, if I'm commencing proceedings, I still like to draft the statement of claim or the defense. I still like to draft the pleading myself. I still like to draft the skeleton argument for an important hearing myself. I quite often make people do the research, but give it to me, and then I do the draft. Sometimes time pressure means, they've got to do a first draft of those documents for me, but my preference is to do those documents myself from scratch without anyone having given me a draft, because it's always better if it's your own thought process rather than working on somebody else's thought process.
What area of practice do you enjoy most? I mean, the intellectual exercise, the law, or the interpersonal skills, the advocacy, the advice to the client?
The bit I like most is winning.
Okay.
I've come to realize I very much enjoy advocacy as long as I win at the end of it. If I lose, I have a very sour experience of the whole thing. I do enjoy problem solving, looking at a case and working out the law in relation to it, but only if I find the answer. There's no fun in bashing your head against a brick wall for 5 days trying to find a solution and coming up with nothing. So it's, for me, actually winning is probably the wrong word. It's actually getting a result which solves a problem, which is what I find valuable out of this job. And in a way, it's the fact that by doing so, you've actually made a difference to somebody. That's the bit which I value in this job.
Now, I've gone through I've gone through your website here, and there's this term UHNW, which I then found out means ultra high net worth individuals, right? And you seem to have a penchant of doing work for them. So the question I want to ask is, do you speak Russian?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
No, because I presume it's all Russian oligarchs and all that. No, right. And is it difficult dealing with extremely rich individuals?
Yes, it is not necessarily easy, particularly for someone like me who doesn't have a lot of time for people who I don't have a huge amount of respect for. Firstly, can I say, there's no penchant about wanting to work for ultra high net worth individuals. In fact, it's a great regret that I no longer do the work for the sort of clients I had when I was a junior barrister, where you really felt you made a real difference to their lives. But it's the nature of the work is that once you get to this level, the very complicated work tends to involve a lot of money. And because we're not talking about company law, we're talking about trusts, they involve real individuals and they happen to be enormously wealthy. Some of them are delightful. Some of them, usually the children of the people who've made the fortune, are not delightful. But I made my reputation in my career by simply by being fairly blunt in the advice which I give whoever I'm giving it to. I tell people what I think about their cases, whether it's what they want to hear or not. That's the way it is.
And it is what it is, right? Okay, quick one. The opponent you respect the most, your career at the bar so far?
Probably Guy Newey, who is now Mr. Justice Newey. Firstly, I have many opponents who I have a huge amount of respect for, who I've seen on many occasions, but I was only ever against Guy Newey once, when I was still a junior barrister, and he was he was a fairly grand silk. And he was brought in on behalf of basically someone who I was accusing of being a fraudster to lend an aura of respectability to said fraudster. And he was a delightful opponent. And we had charming and kind, and he treated me with as much respect as I expect he would treat another silk, even though I was, 10, 15 years his junior. And I very much appreciated that. And, he didn't throw his weight around as he might have done. And the whole experience with Guy, he's obviously, he's got a brain the size of a planet. But you wouldn't know it when you talk to him because he's so modest. I had a huge amount of respect for him.
And on the bench, the judge who challenged you the most?
Again, the judge who challenged me the most, you're probably looking for me to tell you about some brilliant judge who made me think twice. But I have to say, I think that in almost every case you go in better prepared than the judge. And so, you shouldn't be taken by surprise by anything the judge asks you, unless the judge is going off track. And so the judges who challenge me most are the ones who've lost the plot. And one of those is now retired. At one point during a hearing, which was going quite well, he'd spent the morning beating up my opponent. We then had lunch. And then in the afternoon, he got up and he started laying into me. And I actually had to put my foot down. And I was quite rude to him. He was proposing to take judicial notice of things he couldn't possibly have any personal knowledge of. And I told him so. I think I may have used the words, "This is the problem when you parachute a High Court judge like your lordship into the Court of Protection. Your lordship doesn't have any idea about the practice of the Court of Protection. Your lordship can't take judicial notice of anything which happens in the Court of Protection." And there was a sort of long silence. And I carried on thinking, okay, point made, we're off. Carried on with my submissions. Then this little voice came from the bench a few minutes later saying, "You don't know that I don't have any experience with the Court of Protection. You don't know that when I was at the bar that, I might have had a very big Court of Protection practice." And so a little bit of sort of ego massaging was then required. I do it, it's along the lines of, "Oh, well, your lordship was always so grand at the bar. Your lordship, I simply assumed your lordship wouldn't have had any grotty work in the Court of Protection." But anyway, my pupil at the time who was at this point cowering underneath the bench, and my opponent said to me afterwards that it was that moment when you say something rude to your school teacher and you're not quite sure whether your school teacher is going to throw the chalk duster at you. It was that sort of moment.
Right, but you are now, of course, a recorder and a deputy judge yourself.
Yes.
Question is, taking these positions, how's your advocacy changed, or has it changed, or do you have now a different perspective on advocacy? After all, now you're sitting high up, looking down on those advocates.
I don't think it has changed my view of advocacy. It has reinforced my view as to what is good advocacy, which is always to think about what the judge wants and what the judge needs. And certainly when I sit as a criminal recorder, what I want is help from the advocates. That's a good policy to have when you're appearing as an advocate. What can I do to help the judge, and particularly help the judge in a way which means he finds in my favor. But that's advocacy. And there are all sorts of points which irritate the hell out of us. What the other side have done, the fact that they have not, in correspondence, they've not answered our letters and so on. The judge generally doesn't care about any of that. So you've got to work out, what the judge really needs to know to make his decisions, what he wants to know, because it's sitting as a recorder has reinforced my view that that is what you need to do as an advocate. And as you say, I'm also deputy High Court judge, but I haven't started sitting in that role yet. So I'm not due to do that till October. But yeah, that's my view.
For those of us who don't know, because the podcast is going hopefully all over the world, could you just tell our listeners the difference between being a recorder and being a deputy judge?
Yeah. Well, in England, the tier of judges, the structure, we have at the highest level, you have the Supreme Court, then you have the Court of Appeal, then you have the High Court. Underneath the High Court, there are several other tiers of tribunals, but there's also, importantly, the County Court and the Crown Court. If you sit as a recorder, you are sitting as a Crown Court judge or a County Court judge. In my case, I'm a criminal recorder, so I sit as a Crown Court judge. And a recorder is basically someone pulled out of practice, so a practicing barrister or solicitor or somebody who's appointed to sit for, say, 6 weeks of the year in that role. So it's a part-time judge. And so a recorder is sort of county court, so Crown Court level. In my case, I sit in the Crown Court and I deal with jury trials as the judge. As a deputy High Court judge, I'm now assigned to sit in the Chancery Division of the High Court in London as a High Court judge, basically to help support the other High Court judges when they're too busy to deal with their lists. So again, I will sit for up to 6 weeks of the year in the High Court to deal with High Court business.
Because the thing is, when you particularly sit as a recorder, as you said, you do jury trials and all that, that means giving directions for the jury. Is that a challenge considering the practice that you have?
It's really interesting. It is a challenge, of course it is, because the criminal barristers obviously know it comes to them very naturally because it's what they are completely familiar with, and I have to do a lot more homework. But there are lots and lots of translatable skills, you realize, from just being a lawyer. And certainly giving directions to the jury, I don't find very difficult at all. It's about identifying the key elements of the offence and then explaining both the law and the evidence to the jury. And I find that interesting. I mean, it obviously takes work, but I don't find it sort of difficult in the sense that I sit there and worry about it. And it's something which is perfectly capable of being done.
Back to advocacy, I suppose, and to the bar. Could you just tell us, a typical day in the life of Eason Rajah, if you have a particular case, a heavy case? Okay, just describe the day, say, when you're doing the Nizam of Hyderabad case, and how your day starts.
Well, the great joy of being a barrister is every day is different. And so a day when you're not in court is generally a flurry of emails start, before you've even woken up till, the end of the day, in which you're firefighting things which are happening on your various cases. But you said a day in the Nizam of Hyderabad. Well, during the trial, for example, on the day in which I was addressing the judge on what was a key element of trusts law, the day was spent addressing the judge and the judge not understanding.
Okay.
The judge kept getting very irritated with the fact that I wouldn't answer his question. I kept saying, I'm going to come to that, but I need to explain some basic building blocks before we come to the complicated question. Otherwise, you won't understand why the answer is the way it is. And by the end of the day, I got a whole series of emails from two other silks who are on my side, but not for related parties, basically saying, take the low-hanging fruit, don't give the judge a law lecture.
Okay.
And, let's bail out of this because, this is not going well. And the rest of that day was spent working very hard, trying to work out how to explain these various points even better to the judge the next morning. And the next morning, sticking to my guns and going through the law, and the judge suddenly seeing the light.
Oh, okay.
And then the consequence of which is we got a judgment on that point, which was unappealable. If I'd taken the low-hanging fruit, Pakistan would have had an appeal point. So it was necessary. I've got the Tim Otti QC, who was counsel for India, has given me a framed report of the Times of India, the Hyderabad edition, on the day on which the judgment came out. And on the back of it, he has written a little note about my law lecture to the judge.
So on average, how many hours a day do you spend working?
I have to say, when I was a junior barrister, I worked all hours of the day. And by the time I was a senior junior, I was working all hours of the day, 7 days a week, for some years before I took Silk. And it's become much easier since becoming Silk because I have teams, and that's a great help. So I work as little as possible, frankly, now. But even so, I think I tend to work I work sporadically, but pretty much from the moment I wake up till the moment I go to bed. I don't actually try and keep to a sort of 9 to 6 day. So last night we're trying to, the case in which I'm leading another silk, there's a minute of order which needs to be settled, and she clocks off rather earlier, but she gets up. She's up at about 5 in the morning. But stuff needed to be done at midnight last night, so I was doing that. I was telling the juniors what to put into the order so that we could get it off our desks last night. So it went out at 12:30. And that's just making the team work. So the other silk wasn't around to deal with it. By the time I woke up this morning, she'd put 3 hours in terms of finalizing stuff this morning. So
The point that you made about the Nizam case is that, i.e., you decided not to go for the low-hanging fruit and you persisted. Would you say then persistence is the most important quality of an advocate?
no, judgment is the most important quality of an advocate. You don't persist in something, in a point you're going to lose. You only persist if you think you're going to be able to win it. And persistence alone just irritates the judge. So it's judgment, I think, which is the most important quality.
Can I ask some practical aspects of your work? I mean, in a typical huge case that right now you're saying you're leading another silk, and you got teams, obviously. But in terms of, say, witnesses, do you decide upfront who takes this particular witness in terms of cross-examination? Or do you decide on particular areas? Okay, I'll take this witness on this area. You'll take the same witness on another area. And how do you prepare for these sort of things?
Well, to date, in terms of preparation, I always prepare the big witnesses myself. I might, minor witnesses, I might delegate the preparation of the cross-examination to someone more junior in terms of working it up. But I always do all of the advocacy if I'm instructed in a case, and I don't delegate. And I don't split that up, because I'd rather take the view that the reason why people have instructed me is they want me. Clients instructed me. The client wants me to do the job. So that's how I tend to do it. I certainly have done so far.
Do you write down the questions yourself, or you write down just broad areas and then you see how the evidence takes you?
That is a very good question, because initially, for years and years and years, I wrote down simply, more or less points. What I tend to do is I tend to work out what I want to get out of a particular witness. Sit down, what is it at the end of the cross-examination I want to have achieved with this witness? I want them to have said, accepted X, Y, Z, and being realistic. You've got to be realistic about what you're going to achieve with the witness. And then you set about how you're going to get there. And then I tend to have a route map, or used to. So this has evolved for me. It's still evolving. But I used to have a route map, which sort of took me through towards that. But which was usually just broad areas. It usually was, which documents am I going to take them to, and to point out various things. But once you start working in a larger team, it's necessary, I think, to write down the questions you're going to ask and the document, so that the rest of the team can see what you're going to do, and then can input. They can say, don't do that, because if you do that, then the answer might be blank. Or instead of going to that document, there may be a better document to go to. So if you're actually going to use your team, you need to start putting some of this stuff down on paper so that you can share it. In the same way, I never used to have a script. I used to keep everything in my head. I mean, I was once told by a solicitor that there's nothing scarier than having your counsel, i.e. me, open his book as the judge comes into court, stand up and rock it backwards and forwards, and the solicitor see that the book is blank. There are no notes. It's just for recording what the judge says. But that's how I used to do it. But, once you start working with a team, you've got to put it down on paper so that other people can see and contribute. Otherwise, you're just wasting the resources you've got.
So let me just jump in and ask you, you've told us about the cross-examination. What about submissions and thinking about presentation and language? How much time do you spend on doing that?
I spend a lot of time thinking about language and how to put a point. And quite often, it's something you turn over in your head when you're in the shower or as you're walking the dog or whatever. But there is always a way in which to encapsulate a submission, a complicated submission, which can be done, you can, if you think about it, you can usually find that the point boils down to something really quite simple, which one can just encapsulate in a sentence to the judge. And it's quite important to do that. The more complicated the case, the more important it is to actually drill down and say to the judge, this is what this is about. And you've just got to decide X or Y on this point. And then all the other complications will sort themselves out. So I think quite hard about that, what the case is actually, what the issue is actually, which the judge actually has to decide is. And I also think quite hard about how you summarize your own case. This is a point which I learned from Leo Price QC, who was my head of chambers when I joined, the man who, with an enormous work ethic I was telling you about. He would, in chambers tea, he would tell us about a case which he was in, and then he would try out, he would say, don't you think this is, a good description of this case? And he'd come out with a sentence, and what he was doing was simply trying out to see how it landed with us, a pithy way of encapsulating his case in an attractive and usually quite sort of a funny way, which he would then, I realized when I was his junior, he would then roll these points out in front of the Court of Appeal. He said, this is what this case is about. And, everyone would laugh, but it wasn't off the cuff. This was carefully practiced,
right.
tested on an unsuspecting audience before it was rolled out. And, I've learned advocacy requires you, particularly in complicated cases where, there's a morass of issues, to be able to identify what the case is actually about and to be able to summarize issues and cases and your point of view or what your position is on something. You need to be able to do that in a sentence. You need to have a sentence on all the important issues, which, if the judge says, what's your case? My case is X, just like that. You've got to be ready to roll whenever you're asked that question. So yeah, I do think quite hard about those sort of points.
Yep. Okay, we're coming to the end. And the last thing we'd like to ask you about is cases that you've done that stand out for you and why.
Well, the case I always think about as my greatest victory was a case in which I was parachuted in to take over from another much more senior barrister who was double booked. And I went to some county court somewhere, can't even remember where it is now, having read the papers. And it was absolutely hopeless. There's a couple having a dispute about about whether the ex-girlfriend had an interest in the property which had been purchased. And she had her father, who was a vicar, coming to give evidence. And there was also a deacon coming to give evidence. And they were all giving evidence about conversations which were slap bang against what my client said had happened. And I sat him down outside and said, look, we've got to settle this because this is, you're going to lose this. And he started crying. He just said, I'd give her everything which I have, but I don't have any more money to give. There's nothing. We can't settle. And so we had to go and fight. So we went and fought. And at the end of that, and I gave it my all over 4 days or 5 days. And at the end of it, the judge decided that the vicar was lying and the deacon was at least mistaken. And certainly that the girlfriend was lying and that my client was telling the truth. And so we won.
And you've never set foot in a church since, I would imagine.
Yeah, so I remember that. And as soon as the decision came, this client of mine, who's twice my size, big burly man, crying his eyes out, came up, picked me up, and gave me a big bear hug. And my feet off the ground. That's me, wig, gown. He was so happy. And so, for me, that's a prime example of why I came to the bar, to make a difference. So I remember that case.
Oh, that's absolutely, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Eason.
No problem at all. I hope some of it's some use.
No, that was amazing.
Thank you for listening. Keep an eye out for our next episode on our website and social media feeds.
Listen to the voices of the advocate.